I think we're ready to begin. So, hello everyone, I'm Caroline McCracken-Flesher, past convener of the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literatures, and I'm delighted to represent the association today to congratulate Nikki Hessell and Stephen Clothier as the inaugural winners of the Jack Prize. Nikki Hessell is a senior lecturer in English at Herenga, Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, and Stephen Clothier is a librarian for Wellington City Libraries. For our audience, the Jack Prize remembers Ronnie Jack, Professor of Scottish and Medieval Literature at the University of Edinburgh from 1987 to 2004. And he was director of the Bibliography of Scottish Literature in Translation. Professor Jack's work on Scottish literature's continental and Italian dimensions was groundbreaking, starting with his book, The Italian Influence in Scottish Literature in 1972. He championed Scottish literature as open to the world and in dialogue with that world. The prize is awarded annually for the best article on a subject related to reception or diaspora in Scottish literatures, and that includes works in Scots, English, Gaelic, Latin. To introduce our winners for 2018, Nikki Hessell. Her books include Romantic Literature and the Colonized World, Lessons from Indigenous Translations, 2018, and Sensitive Negotiations, Indigenous Diplomacy and British Romantic Poetry, which is forthcoming this year. She works on projects about Romanticism and Indigenous diplomacy and has been funded by a Marsden grant. She also, the broader project is entitled The Poetics of Treaties, Settler Treaty Making in 18th Century Poetry. Stephen Clothier, for his part, develops innovative library services, including programs to do with future technologies and digital literacy, in which, of course, we're all increasingly dependent, particularly this year, as well as traditional read-write literacies. And obviously, Stephen also engages in literary and cultural exploration and research and collaboration. They won for their article, Marian Aotearoa, Burns' Ling'ring Star and Scottish Identity in New Zealand, which focuses on the international circulation of Burns's work and how international preference operates differently place to place, and how different modes and venues of circulation give meaning to those preferences and importance and weight to those preferences. So now what I would like to do is turn to our awardees and ask you to talk about the process of developing this article to begin with, since it's a collaborative piece, and the committee was both surprised and pleased to see a collaborative piece, and then, of course, to recognize the importance of this collaborative piece. So could you tell us how you developed your partnership and how it strengthened your research?
Sure, I think I'm going to kick off on this one and want to start by saying thank you for the Jack Prize. It was a real surprise and honour to win it for this article. I'm sure we're both really thrilled by it. And to have the opportunity to talk about it. It feels like a long time ago, 2018. A lot has happened to all of us, as well as to myself and Stephen, but it's really great to have the opportunity to speak today. So the story of how we came to be working together comes out of one of the projects you just mentioned, Caroline, which is when I was writing romantic literature in the colonised world, I was working on a Māori translation of this poem, Burns's Temerian Heaven, which is sometimes called Thou Ling'ring Star. And it wasn't a song I had ever heard of before when I first found the Māori translation to examine. And it occurred to me that if it was being translated into Māori, it must have had some kind of circulation in New Zealand. So as a side project, I thought, wouldn't it be great to investigate whether it was indeed a really popular poem in New Zealand history that had fallen out of fashion and fallen out of favour here somehow. And that seemed to me to be a perfect project for a student to be working on. And we have a really good scheme here in New Zealand called the Summer Scholars Scheme, where over the summer an academic can propose a self-contained project and students apply to be the person who does that research. It's very competitive, partly because it's quite well funded. And Stephen was the successful applicant for that project. He'll be able to tell you more about himself, but he was at that stage, no longer, as you know, at that stage an undergraduate here. He had been in an 18th century literary studies course that I'd been teaching and done extremely well. And he also had a background in music, which made him kind of perfect for a project on Burns. So this is how we came to this, to be working on this project together. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything in there.
Yeah, I think that about covers it. I was, immensely excited to work on this project because, as Nikki mentioned, my sort of alter ego is in music academia, and there's such interesting and cogent links between Burns and musical traditions, all across the world, but particularly in New Zealand. And I think that is evidenced in some of the really interesting references to Burns's work that we found throughout various publications in New Zealand. And so, yeah, it was a deeply exciting project for me. And as a kind of aside, my background in libraries and in sort of database creation and evaluation was also, I think, quite useful in this project, because a lot of it was involving some really detailed and sort of manual work with archives and digital archives, and putting together a sort of database of references to this work that's attempted to be as broad as possible and covering the entire country from top to bottom. So really exciting piece of work. Yeah.
Well, indeed, and it's exciting to read, and just the sheer reach of the materials that you found. Can you talk a little bit, excuse me, about some of those more unusual pieces? You already mentioned the translation into Maori that was the germ of the project, but I know as you delved into records, you were in newspapers, you were in programs from small town events and so on. Can you both talk about some of those resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way the project was structured, we started with the sort of initial discovery phase of just trying to identify as many different resources as possible across the whole sort of published and unpublished corpus of New Zealand material that we could find. And so we're very lucky to be based in Wellington, so close to the National Library, which is, of course, the legal deposit library for our country. And one of the National Library's flagship projects is a project called Papers Past, which is a really ambitious archive of essentially, well, it's attempting to be an archive of all New Zealand periodicals and newspapers, full stop. Fully digitized, fully indexed and word searchable. And it's obviously very much still under development. And even across the course of this project, there were whole new publications being added to Papers Past that made their way into our research. And to this day, they're still adding new publications as they find them, sort of unearthed from, small town physical archives and, library basements and things like that. So the sort of the meat of my investigation was a really thorough combing of Papers Past and of other National Library sort of archive collections and special collections from other libraries across the country, including the Hocken Library in Dunedin, which we might talk about a little bit more further down the track, because Dunedin is a hugely significant sort of locus of Scottish identity and culture in this country. As well as Auckland's libraries, university libraries across the country and so forth. So this kind of culminated in the creation of a database of references to this work, Thou Ling'ring Star, Aotearoa in Heaven, that spans a really wide frame, both geographically and through time. In excess of 200 unique references from sort of various sort of small town country rags, advertisements for lectures and in concerts and elocutions, program notes and materials from concerts held in the National Library's physical collections. It even actually, my investigation even led me to some really unusual areas. And I actually don't think that you know this, Nikki, but I trawled many secondhand bookstores around the city and across the country, and found some really fascinating stuff, including this copy of the complete letters of Burns from, it was published in 1914, and is full of annotations from the original owner, which was deeply interesting, as you can imagine. And several of these letters refer specifically to the poem in question. And this is a work that was widely in publication and in circulation in New Zealand at the time, as well as this little book here, the Little Blue Book of Burns Songs, which has Thou Ling'ring Star to Mary in Heaven on page 9. And again, this was a hugely popular piece of material that circulated throughout the colony in its earliest days. So our search led us to many different locations, many really fascinating areas, and the sheer range of different kinds of articles and pieces of ephemera that refer to the poem, I think evidences the popularity of this work. Yeah.
You're bringing home to me how desperately we all want to be, going through books in a bookstore these days.
I know.
You could probably see me leaning forward and getting closer into New Zealand to see what it is that you have there. But that's the immensely pleasurable stage of research, isn't it? When you don't really know what you're going to find and you've got a brand new question, and really delving into archives and bookstores and people's attics and all that wonderful stuff. Yeah, and then producing this really intriguing article. So what I'd like you to do now, if you could, is just talk a little bit more about the article and perhaps elaborate on it for the people who have not yet read it. I'm sure we're all, they're all keen to read it now and to go, not to mention go back to the bookstore. But can you tell us more about the article itself? Help us to understand what's really unusual about this poem in the context of his work and the reception of his work.
Sure, I'll start off with that one. I obviously, in terms of the project, just back to the project design, my instinct was that there would be something here, that we would find a kind of tradition, but I was really blown away by the extent of the examples Stephen was able to unearth, and just how pervasive the poem really was in early sort of Pākehā settler culture. So that the argument of the poem, of the essay, is partly to talk about the breadth of that reach, from the what we would expect in the settler colonies in terms of Burns clubs and Caledonian clubs and so on. You kind of expect that, but actually into every little Scottish community, this poem, and indeed as a song as well, not simply as a poem, had become a kind of glue to hold that community together. It had become a touchstone that reforming some kind of identity in the colonies was often sort of the poem was the locus for doing that. I was really interested in the ways in which that moved away from the obvious Scottish settlements in, for example, Dunedin, where you would expect this to be prominent. One of my favourite examples that Stephen found and that we talk about in the article is in Thames, which is a kind of mining town, and the way in which, as Scottish settlers moved, a kind of internal migration within the country, the poem and the song kind of follows them and gets picked up in these new places. So part of the argument is just around establishing both breadth and depth of the penetration of this. Part of it is about the way in which Scottish settler identity does move between the written and the oral, the performance, music and singing is an important part of that. And another point I think that's important about the project is we know a great deal about the transatlantic influence of Burns, and there's been a lot of work recently establishing that, and it's an obvious kind of thing to want to focus on. But the idea of a trans-Pacific Burns, I think, is really important to think about as well. The migration of the Scots through the Pacific and the way in which Burns does influence settler cultures, but through them also Indigenous cultures and other groups of migrants who are here. So I think adding the trans-Pacific Burns into our thinking about a global Burns is actually really important, and that's something I wanted to get through in the article. And Stephen's work in just really bringing out the extent of this, so that we weren't just making a tenuous argument that maybe there's something here, is really important for crystallizing that.
And you actually found there was a stunning amount of stuff there, right? It wasn't tenuous at all. I remember the story that you mentioned where the rendition of this song becomes part of, it's a shorthand then for a certain kind of cultural engagement within other texts as well. It was absolutely fascinating. And that issue about the trans-Pacific as well as the transatlantic Burns, you'll recall we had a conference in Hawaii a couple of years past when we could still go around the world about writing the wide Pacific and Scots in the Pacific. And it was an eye-opener for all of us who attended, who are more focused on Scotland or on America. And the work that you're doing, I think, is tremendously important. And in fact, could you talk a little bit too about how, both of you, how that the argument does stand to impact wider Burns scholarship? Our expectations of Burns, or our expectation of who read and responded. Does it show Burns, do you think, in a different global light as well?
I think so. One of the very interesting things about this sort of study in particular is that this poem, To Mary in Heaven, is I would argue not one of Burns's more well-known works outside of New Zealand. It certainly has in sort of post-1960 Burns criticism has had fairly negative reputation. It's in a sort of quite affected sort of mode of very formal and poetic English. There's not really any of the sort of characteristic sort of Scots influences that you see in the language. It is very much a sort of straight up and down romantic, religio-romantic poem. And so I think it's interesting and educative to reflect on the ways in which sort of current reception of Burns's work is absolutely not global, and it very much is reflective of this particular time and place and the way in which we currently see Burns's work, but his influence across history and particularly in sort of locuses of the Scottish diaspora in New Zealand. The reception history tells you a lot about the sort of self-reflexive mode of culture creation that goes on in any colonized society. It seems something that kind of stood out to me is the sort of extreme localness of the use of this poem. There are very, very few references to it actually in national publications. It's very much localized to small towns, to sort of country halls, sort of fundraising efforts for the local church, things like that. It's not so much Scottish expatriates in early colonial New Zealand wanting to sort of proclaim their Scottishness on some kind of national stage. It's very much a self-reflexive reifying of what they view to be sort of part of their sort of Scottishness. Nikki, you might be able to reflect more on some of those thoughts.
The one thing I'd add to that is that a clear reason that poem falls out of favour in Burns' studies, I think, is partly what Stephen's mentioned about the sort of form and language of it, but also we're much more drawn to the political Burns and the radical Burns. But I think we perhaps then miss the ways in which a poem like this is political when it gets used in this way. That making of a local polity around a Burns text, even one that feels very apolitical, that's important, and it's important for the history of a country like ours. It's important for thinking about how settler colonialism operates at a literary level as well. As you know, it's not just about land acquisition, it's not just about military violence, it's about a kind of reinscribing your own culture on a land that did not initiate these texts, right? These texts are coming from elsewhere and they're being reinscribed on the landscape. And Stephen's point about localism, I think, is really crucial, that this is not a big nation-making project, it's a town and village making project, a sort of micro example of how settler colonialism works and the ways in which we need to be, you know, it's good to be enthusiastic and excited about finding these examples, but also alert to the politics of what's going on there in terms of creating these settler communities in what they displace, what they are pushing aside in order to say. Burns is important here. The Scottish diaspora is important here. So I'm, of course, very interested in that relationship between settler colonial connections to the literature of their own countries and our own past. And I'm speaking as someone who's, like a lot of Pākehā New Zealanders, a Scottish descendant, but also what harm is done that way. I think we should be accountable as a field to really taking that seriously, that this is not just an exercise in nostalgia or kind of positive community building. There's a cost to that, and it's not, for the most part, borne by the settlers themselves.
And I think it is worthy of mention that the Māori voice in all this, despite the translation that exists, that was kind of, as you mentioned, the germ of this project, the Māori voice is not heard really in this body of research. The Māoriverse in New Zealand, the Māori voice in New Zealand print culture is not pronounced at all in the period that we were studying, and it's very much a voice that was sort of missing from that original body of work. And I think that Nikki's point about contextualizing sort of settler community building within this wider discussion is occurring within New Zealand of what was displaced and what continues to be displaced by those settler communities is deeply, deeply important. It's very significant to us here. And also her point about this sort of mode of community building being inscribed upon the landscape is actually, I think, well, quite literal. And to return to the question of Dunedin, in the centre of the Dunedin town square, there's an enormous statue of Burns. Of course, Burns's nephew was one of the founders of the city of Dunedin, and there's you can see generated in the references to this statue in newspapers, both here and abroad, the kind of mythologizing of Burns, I suppose, as this sort of figure within sort of this new you know, pan-Pacific kind of Burns culture. And the mythology that's being propagated is that this statue depicts Burns in the sort of creative, passionate throes of composing this work, Our Ling'ring Star to Mary in Heaven. So it inscribed itself on the landscape here in a very literal sense. Yeah.
So I think our listeners or viewers will have a real sense from this of how interesting this particular essay is, but also how important it is. Because I think you're absolutely right that the broad cultural engagement is complex, needs to be approached with nuance, needs to appreciate impacts that are sometimes negative on a population and how those work, and also how sometimes one of the things that was visible in Hawaii is how a local population occasionally can rewrite things, and that sounds like there's work you still want to do or still might do following on from this. Could you talk a little bit about the work that you see in your futures?
I'll tackle this one first. So I think this is an embarrassing thing to admit sort of 15 minutes into the conversation, but I'm not really a Scottish studies person,
Okay.
as you'll be able to tell from my background. I mean, I'm a romanticist, and I'm particularly interested in romanticism and settler colonialism and the relationship with Indigenous peoples. So part of what it has led me to is thinking about treaty making, and you mentioned the Poetics of Treaties, which is the broader project I'm involved in at the moment. And while that's not, essentially focused on Scottish literary studies, I'm at work on some ideas around Walter Scott and treaty making. And in fact, I'm actually hosting a one-day symposium in August to mark the 250th anniversary of Scott. The symposium's called Walter Scott in the Settler Colonies. So we're going to be talking about Scott's role in settler colonialism more broadly. So definitely working on this project and seeing the extensiveness of this literary inheritance in New Zealand has made me enthusiastic to think about that more broadly. And I'm excited to be carrying on with a sort of slightly different angle, not a Burns angle, but a connected kind of Scottish literary angle. Yeah.
I think when the cultural context is significant, you never know where you're going to end up, right? I mean, I'm a Victorianist who does Walter Scott, so yeah. I understand the question. And Stephen, what about you? Are there archives or resources or questions now that you're pursuing?
Well, I mean, I suppose my kind of professional life has led me astray from academia, so to speak. My primary field is in public librarianship, where I do actively research and conference presentations on topics like early literacy, information literacy, future technologies, and things like that. So I'm very much active in that field. But as for literary studies, limited engagement at the moment, I would say, but that doesn't preclude potential future directions. And I am very interested in the future, kind of returning to the field of literary studies and sort of seeing what might happen there. But as for right now in the immediate future, my sort of area of influence is primarily in the field of library science. Yeah.
But every great cultural exploration runs through the library, right? And runs through all the resources that you're working on. And so
yeah, indeed. And I'm very fortunate actually that the library that I currently work for in Wellington City is actually very active in the sort of sphere of literary research, and there have been some really interesting discoveries that have been made in our libraries with the help of our sort of research staff and also external researchers from institutions like Victoria University. So it's a really enriching place to be working in this field for sure.
Sounds like it indeed, and I think we're all going to be really interested to see where your paths align in the future. Right, because this one turned out to be so very, very productive, and we're really grateful to have had the opportunity to consider the essay, and then, of course, to recognize its very real importance. So, thank you so much for the opportunity to learn more about the article and to learn about your work more widely. And we really are looking forward to encountering your future research, whatever it happens to be on, Stephen. It's all connected, right? So thank you again so much.
Thank you very much. It's been really wonderful to get a chance to revisit this and to talk to you.
Yeah, I have to echo Nikki's words there. It's actually been wonderful for the two of us to reconnect over this as well. So thank you very much indeed.
And of course, right now we value this kind of connection even more than we did. So the Jack Prize will only become more important going forward in terms of how it connects us all.